So I'd like to thank my many co-authors who worked on this over the last number of years, really. What if you were given a set of people who had a confirmed diagnosis of a condition, another set where you didn't know their status, and you could characterize both sets of people with covariates? What if you could rank those unknown people by probability of the condition, and then estimate the true proportion of that condition among those unknowns, and do this even without chart review? Could you do with that? You could inform disease screening with reliable metrics, especially positive predictive value. You could estimate a disease incidence using only confirmed cases. You could discover and correct data quality problems, find people who fall through the cracks of the healthcare system, economize on chart review and clinician diagnosis, and increase power for comparative effectiveness research, particularly when outcomes are missing or undiagnosed. And we did just that in a study of self-harm that we presented at last year's OHDSI Symposium, where the outcome of self-harm in a survival analysis was either directly coded or imputed with different levels of confidence. But you say, well, come on, how can you possibly differentiate between cases or positives versus negatives without confirmed negatives? How could a method deal with uncommon or rare conditions? How can you trust your estimates without chart review? And if you had such a method, what's its limitations? So this cartoon shows the method really visually. So imagine you had a machine learning algorithm where you take the positives, call those ones, and the unlabeled, which have both positives and negatives, but you don't know what they are, and you call those 0. You do machine learning with, say, cross-validation. Doesn't matter so much what method you use as long as you get a probability between 0 and 1. You get density estimates for the positives that you can scale to sum to 1, the unlabeled, and then the negatives you basically would estimate as unlabeled minus positives. And the challenge is, how can you estimate that fraction of positives alpha? And you can see here, if you estimate too high, you can't have the positive density be greater than the positive plus negative. If it's too low, you don't get the right answer either. And if it's just right, in the simulated data, we see that the estimated and actual true controls match. How you estimate this, we'll skip over, but essentially this is an error function that you can find an inflection point for. We compared our method against a leading one called CleanLab on simulated data. So the true answer here is 1%. Ours gets the right answer. The other method's way off. Similarly, at this whole range, even up to 90%, we get our error bars covering the truth. However, almost all methods, including these, make the selected completely at random assumption, where the positives are equally likely to be selected for labeling. So what this means, and this is generally not going to hold in reality, because people, who may be unlabeled are not going to be drawn from the same distribution as the positives that you're using. So anyhow, we applied this method for self-harm in the VA data, where we could do some chart review, and we found rather low estimates using this method, and we actually are quite certain, based on our chart review, that the selected completely at random assumption fails. However, those people that we're ranking as having very high probability of self-harm do have self-harm. When we were dealing with PTSD, which is different, like self-harm tends to be not coded a large fraction of the time. Here we're trying to detect people who have undiagnosed PTSD. Generally, you'll get a diagnosis code if you're diagnosed. And the whole challenge is a little bit like Anna's, is how do you get a good matching control for a case? And so we've done a lot of elaborate stuff to basically match the start and end periods of a matched control. And I won't go into all the details here, but there's more detail on our poster. We applied this in the VA population for PTSD, and see with this method that makes the scar assumption, about 7.5% of the unlabeled veterans have probable PTSD, and chart review suggests kind of a mixed bag in that most of those people had positive screens for PTSD, but still didn't get diagnosed. However, those who were later, we'd held out a future year and found out that the distribution of predictions for those who had converted was consistent with the positives. In summary, phenotype incidence estimation with only positives feasible, but has its limits. If the scar assumption holds, our technique is spot on. It seems in the VA self-harm scar assumption fails, but for PTSD, because veterans are screened annually as part of policy, it seems to hold, but further work's needed. And just as a cool thing that we've done in the time since our lightning talk, here's simulated data on our old method, where we simulated increasingly from left to right, worse and worse departures from the scar assumption, seeing we get really bad estimates. And we have a new algorithm, it's unpublished, that we can get quite close, still within some error, even when we created totally imbalanced, from 1/31 up to 16/31 ratios in the unlabeled among different types of positives, and so we're pretty excited that as this work continues, we can really infer these missing phenotypes. So with that, I thank you all, and thank you for staying late.